Thank you very much. Lisa Gartner is on the program as giving the presentation, but she has fallen ill and has a little bit of a lost voice, so I'm going to step in for her. I just want to recognize very quickly some members of our team that are here despite some trouble getting out of Tampa Bay this morning. Michael LaForgia is with us, Nathaniel Lash is with us, and Lisa is there and trying not to spread her plague any further. I just want to give a quick overview of our project. This was an 18-month effort by the Tampa Bay Times. It involved 3 reporters, a data team, more than $10,000 spent on records, and it ended up being 5 stories that published over 6 months. This was a huge endeavor for our newspaper and the largest education story that I've ever been privileged to be a part of. One thing I wanted to mention is just that Lisa and I just came from an education conference where the theme was segregation and equity in schools. But when we started this project, we did not actually realize that it was about segregation. Lisa and I are education beat reporters, and Michael is an investigative reporter. And we were Lisa and I were looking at discipline data that showed some disturbing trends, especially in elementary schools involving African American children. And I was sort of separately looking at test scores over a period of time. And we both saw some things that concerned us. And as I had covered a few other counties in Florida, and what sort of struck me in Pinellas County as a new reporter there a few years ago was that in other counties that I had covered, their African American students were doing much better than those in Pinellas County, but they were treating this issue of this achievement opportunity gap as sort of a crisis. And in Pinellas County, they weren't really talking about it at all. So Lisa and I talked about this being something that we should take a deeper dive into. And then it kind of didn't go anywhere for a little while. We're daily people, so we have to churn out stories. Luckily, I'm married to Michael, and he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, and I, talk about education probably a little too much at home, and at some point he kind of took this issue that Lisa and I were talking about to his boss, Chris Davis, who is an incredibly talented investigative editor at the paper, and they agreed to work with us. And I like to tell this story because Michael likes to deny it. But when the week that Michael and Chris basically said they were going to work with us was the same week that I was giving birth to our son. We had a 16-month-old at home, and as a sign of how close everyone on the project is, Lisa actually came to visit me that night when I had delivered our son. But when I was in labor, Michael, being sort of the obsessive reporter that he is, said to me in the hospital room, "What can you tell me about segregation in Pinellas County?" And he likes to deny that, which is why I like to bring it up. And that is how the project sort of got started. And just so you know, everyone is still friends. Everyone is still married. Our son is now 2, and our daughter is now 3. But so I want to talk about the 5 stories that we ended up writing. The first story basically was looking at what happened to these 5 elementary schools as the result of a decision by our school board to basically abandon integration efforts in 2007. And at the time, they had recognized that that concentrating a large number of poor children in these 5 schools would create some educational challenges. And as a kind of in recognition of that, they said they were going to put more money and more resources into those schools. They were going to recruit the best teachers. And basically, they said all of that, and then they didn't do any of it. And the first story is basically unraveling some of that history and exploring that issue. The second story was sort of looking at something that came out of some of the things we were hearing in interviews with families. All of us interviewed tons of families. Lisa did a ton of work interviewing families in the community, interviewing teachers. And one of the things that we heard a lot about was that there was just a lot of violence and chaos and disruption in these 5 schools. One of the things that was especially striking for me and for us was this finding that all 5 elementary schools had more violent incidents in 1 year than all of our high schools combined. Now, the reason that's striking is you usually don't expect a lot of violence in an elementary school. So the fact that they had more violence than our high schools was incredibly striking, and we thought it was worthy of writing the second day about, which we had not originally planned to do. Day 3 was sort of looking at this very simple, seemingly simple issue of whether or not the children in these schools had the same quality of teacher that other children in the community had. And the answer that we came to is that no, they didn't. But that actually took a great deal of work, a great deal of data analysis. Nathaniel is laughing because he had to do a lot of that work. And basically, we were looking at an incredible flight of teachers out of the schools after the vote was made. One of the data points that I always come back to is that more than 100 teachers with 10 or more years of experience fled the schools after the vote, in the years immediately after the vote. And they were largely replaced with inexperienced teachers. They also were replaced by teachers who had sort of troubled backgrounds. Maybe they hadn't worked out so well in another school and then they got hired in these schools. So that ended up being day 3. Day 4 was something that Lisa and Michael worked on a lot, and Nathaniel as well. But looking at sort of this issue of whether or not African American students were being disciplined unfairly. And it was looking at the district as a whole. The first 3 stories focused a lot on these 5 schools. This was sort of going broader and looking at this issue of discipline disparities for the entire county. And one of the things that we found in that story was that African American students in Pinellas County were facing far more discipline than white students. It's one of the largest disparities in Florida, in fact, and that our county, because they had not at the time taken steps to sort of make sure that discipline would be applied evenly, students were getting punished for things that were basically subjective, like defiance. On issues that were more objective, like having drugs or guns or those sorts of things, the disparity was not there as much. So that was sort of a telling issue. And because of that story, Pinellas County has actually changed a lot of their discipline policies in the last few months. The last story in the series, Day 5, was looking at these schools that in Pinellas County we call them fundamental schools. They're sort of back to basic schools. They stress discipline and homework. They have required parent meetings. They're extremely popular schools. They always have waiting lists. And they were actually intended to promote integration in the county. But what ended up happening basically over the 40-year history of these schools is that they became enclaves for white, wealthy families, essentially. And they were doing very little to help integration in the county. One of the reasons for that, and the story kind of traced several reasons for that, but one of the large reasons for that was that the school district doesn't provide transportation to those schools. And in a county with very poor public transportation options and where 80% of our African American population is low income, that basically translates into a racial bias. And to make that issue more real for people, we found families where they had by luck gotten into these schools and then loved the school, very happy with the school, and then the transmission goes out in the car and they don't have a way to get there anymore and they have to go to a different school. So we found families to make that issue a little bit more real for people who maybe can't relate to some of those struggles. The other thing that the county did over this history of these schools was they took schools that originally were opened in African American neighborhoods and then found ways to move them, essentially close them down and move them to white, wealthy neighborhoods, which made them even less accessible to the Black population in Pinellas County. And so that's the 5 stories, and I think I will stop there.